Of the hundreds of mothers and fathers who developed all of the birthing better skills in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, some of them in the 1970s were having home births in the United States, although most of us, like myself, gave birth in the hospital. In the United States, there were no midwives. They had been outlawed from the late 1950s. However, the people who attended home births were obstetricians, obstetrical nurses, just old plain nurses, what were called lay midwives, and there were also Vietnam paramedics who had come back from the war. This was the early 1970s. Most of the birthing better families who developed these skills were going to give birth in the hospital, but many of them also gave birth at home. So when the birthing better skills were developing in the early 1970s, they were always developing around what could we do, what if, or how about, or had we known. We saw childbirth as incredibly pragmatic. It was what they call in New Zealand a hard yakka. It was hard work. That's why it was called labor. And in 1970, as mentioned in other videos, 95% of us labored under all circumstances. Everything was considered normal, natural, and physiological. The medical profession was just not that sophisticated. We couldn't get up and walk around. We couldn't eat. We couldn't drink. However, our husbands could be with us. And we were all, hundreds of millions of us, taking Lamaze classes and Bradley classes and learning skills. So I have to keep reminding you of that time because humans have very short-term memory. Ina May Gaskin hadn't written her book Spiritual Midwifery until the end of the 1970s. So people were having births at home. The beginning of the natural birth movement came from having the second global childbirth concept, which was skills-based. As mentioned previously, the first global childbirth concept that always exists and always will is you never know what your birth is going to be like, followed often by, therefore there's nothing you can really do to prepare for it. But what Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed said was, yes, low-risk women can prepare for birth by learning breathing and relaxation skills. And from Grantley Dick Reed's viewpoint, he had written in the late 1950s that you should have childbirth without fear. These two elements were in play in the 1970s. Bradley and Lamaze classes focused on low-risk women to achieve three goals: natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. And the Grantley Dick Reed approach, which was no fear of childbirth, with the assumption that if you lacked fear, you would have no pain. And I talk about that in another video. So when Birthing Better Families began to develop the skills, many of us were going to use them in hospital around all the assessments, monitoring procedures, because there were no choices back then. We went in and we had the assessments, the monitoring procedures of our local hospital, whether we liked it or not. However, because we had skills and our husbands came with us, hundreds and millions of us for a generation coped better. We addressed the second global childbirth goal, which was suffering. Those of us who wanted to have home births mostly did it for either religious reasons, because they would never seek medical care under any circumstance, regardless of whether it was pregnancy or childbirth, and people who were called hippies or alternative or back to the land people that wanted to do things more naturally. Back then, it was not easy to transfer from a home birth to a hospital. Since midwives were outlawed in all 50 states, different states responded to home birth in a different manner. There were also quite a number of people who accidentally had home births. They birthed in the back of a taxi or on the way to the hospital or in the middle of the night. And there were, of course, people who birthed alone. Women who birthed alone because their husband was at work or overseas in the military, or because it just happened so quickly. People wanted to feel more skilled. They wanted to feel more confident. So we developed the skills. What did they do for home births? What did skills do for home births? Well, they did two things. Because in the 70s and the 80s, we knew in a hospital that 95% of women were laboring anyway, we really didn't think about anything beyond everybody's giving birth, and it's just sort of a place, either a hospital or a home. We wanted people who could help us. But we realized that the biggest problem problem in home birth was transferring. So birthing better families that were focused on home birth began to be focused on what could they do to prevent having to transfer, and what could they do if they did transfer. Now, we had a 10-year period where the birthing better skills that were being developed were basically around breathing, communication, and touch, and some of the soft skills. It wasn't until the 80s when society made this massive shift and the cesarean rate tripled from 5% to almost 15%, that we began to look at skills to deal with the reason why the cesarean rate was going up. And the cesarean rate wasn't going up because doctors were running around with knives wanting to cut us open. It was because we got birth control, we had safe abortions, women wanted to go out into the workplace, and our families reduced in size. And that meant we put much more emphasis on the medical profession to make certain that our babies survived, which was not included in the first global childbirth goal, which was a live mother. Every traditional culture and modern cultures knew that babies could die at birth, and that was accepted. But by the 1980s, that became less acceptable. If you're having 6 kids, it's more acceptable you lose one. If you're having 2 kids, it's not. So society put pressure on the medical profession, and the cesarean rate went up. The desire for VBACs went up as well, and it was hard to have a VBAC with a classical cesarean. In society, fashion changed. We started to wear bikinis. So we didn't want to be left with an ugly scar, and we wanted to have a safer VBAC, and we wanted to be awake, and we wanted our partner to be with us during a surgical birth. Now, what does this have to do with a home birth? Because if a home birth transfers to the hospital, there's a possibility that there will be a cesarean. Not a likely possibility, but a possibility, depending on the reason and what happens. But the reason I'm going over this again with you is in that unique time in the 1980s when the cesarean rate tripled. It tripled because modern women no longer accepted having the long births people could have, and that certainly people had when I gave birth in 1970, because cesareans were major abdominal surgery. Women were knocked out, and it was done to save a woman's life, not a baby's life. So in the 1980s, with all the societal change and fashion change and change in the medical profession, just to be honest with you, women didn't want to labor for 72 or 96 hours. They were more content to choose a cesarean, knowing that the bikini cut was not visible and it made a VBAC safer, and she could be awake to see the baby born and her husband could be with her. So the cesarean rate just went way up. And so that's when dads developed the body skills around birthing better. And they did that so that when we prepared our body for birth, we wanted to make certain if we were having a home birth that we didn't have to go into the hospital because we were having a long labor. So let me take you back to the 1970s before this change occurred. It was at a time where nobody did anything. The medical profession would give women strong pain relief and sometimes augment the labor, but basically they just let labors go on and on and on and on. And that was true in home births as well. They just went on and on and on and on. Yes, women could get up and walk or do whatever they wanted and eat, and they were in their own home. But labor is labor. You have to do it one moment after the other moment. One inhale, followed by an exhale, followed by an inhale, and your body is in some posture or position all the time, and your head's still working, and your partner either has skills to help you or doesn't, and the midwife is either with you for the whole time, or she comes at some future time when she feels that birth is closer. In the United States, midwives tended to come very early, because this began to be tied up to what became the belief around midwifery care, which is a midwife should be there when you wanted her. That was not true in other countries that had midwives, because most countries, beside the United States, had always had midwives and always had home births. And in some countries, they were nurse midwives. In other countries, they were direct entry midwives. And home birth was perfectly accepted. In fact, in the UK, after the Second World War, women were pretty much pushed into home births because the hospitals were occupied by wounded soldiers coming back from the war. The United States was unique. It had a Medical Practice Act rather than a Commonwealth medical care service. So in the United States, that's what we were working with, state by state, their own rules about home births. But nobody could stop them. You just didn't always want to go into the hospital, but you didn't want to stay home for the baby or the mother to die, because then that became a legal issue. So in the 70s, when we were developing the skills, lacking the body skills that developed 10 years later. But we still knew that you wanted to have the labor keep moving along as best as possible. Let me just repeat this. The birthing better skills that developed in the 70s to the 80s were mostly around breathing, communication, touch, relaxation, and the soft skills, because 95% of us labored in the United States, and women who were having cesareans were given a general anesthetic. When the cesarean rate tripled in the 1980s, it was fathers who developed the body skills of birthing better, and those body skills were put into a mixed media resource in 2000, because it took that long, from the 80s to 2000, for us to be able to create a cost-effective mixed media resource. But home births changed once the dads developed the body skills, because we could create space, mobility, stay open, and create softness inside our body. And we also were able to notice when labors were not progressing and do something about it. We learned through the body skills that the baby is giving us a message through each contraction. And if each contraction has a good peak, then the baby is basically saying to the mother, I'm fine, your positions are fine, there's nothing stopping me from opening you up and coming down through and out. However, if the contraction had a plateau on the top instead of a peak, the baby is saying, hey mom, there's something that you are doing. Either you have tension inside, or the positions that you are in don't help me, or something like that. And so therefore, home births became much more enjoyable. They didn't linger. We had many fewer transfers to the hospitals. And if we did, we could continue to use the skills to keep the labor moving along. But what we also knew is if we went into the hospital for birthing better families, we were going to continue to use our skills. What we discovered about going into the hospital in the 70s was what people at home thought was becoming a problem. 9 out of 10 times in the hospital, they just admitted the woman and then ignored her like they did everybody else. Usually the reason that people transferred from a home birth had to do with long labors. People got tired. Yes, there were some very clear medical emergencies. The midwives prided themselves on not being medical. They just left birth alone. They were trying at that point to find a way to legalize themselves state after state. They wanted to be seen of as peers and respected by the medical profession. That wasn't something that I or Birthing Better Families got into. As far as we were concerned, it really was about whether we wanted to have our baby at home or in a birth center or in a hospital. And then ultimately, where did we end up having our baby? Which was whether it was home and planned or not planned, in the car to the way to the hospital, in the back of a taxi, in a hospital, having a labor or a cesarean. It didn't matter. We just ignored all of that and just said, we need to be skilled. So we took skills with us into the hospital when we transferred from a home birth. And we continue to use them. Whether or not we continued to labor, we had a cesarean if we could be awake. And our births were all empowered births. Yeah, sure, we didn't like this or we didn't like that. But it wasn't that we failed. We were still working through the activity of birthing our baby. And many of the hospital births that had many layers of medical care on top of them were some of the most empowered births, because women were using the skills either by themselves or with their partner when they had tubes coming out of every hole in their body, and when people were fiddling with them all the time, and they just focused on what they could do for themselves. And they felt incredibly empowered when they told their birth story. And birth stories are what lasts a lifetime. So this is what I'm saying to you now. Become skilled to have a home birth. It doesn't matter where you have your baby. Your baby's birth is important to you. And fortunately, you now have choices. And in some states, it's legal for you to have a home birth attended by a midwife. But it's your birth. Where you're having your baby is just a place, but you still have to do the activity of birthing your baby. Don't assume that by choosing a different place than a hospital, that therefore you should not be skilled. Become skilled and use your skills. Now, there are some things that we learned about having home births and using Birthing Better skills. We learned that the transition from pregnancy into birth was often very vague. And when we learned the skills, we weren't in labor. So we couldn't practice labor before we were in labor. However, that vague period before we actually knew we were in labor was really the time where we started to implement and use our skills. Because dads were highly skilled at the same time, they became more focused with us. So we used our skills very, very early on. Some people will say, well, I didn't start to use my skills until things got heated up. And we found that skills weren't as successfully used at that point because it was difficult to focus when things got really heated up. And we didn't have a habit of using them. So the one thing we suggest is use your skills very early on and play around with some of the ones that you're not using. Remind yourself how to create space in your body and make certain that you're opening up and softening in your body during this early period of time. And just accept what it is. And we have a video on both the positive and negative voice when you're thinking bad thoughts and how you manage that. And we also have one on niggling labor and what we learned. The one question we learned, which was, don't go into labor tired. That's the solution. And the question is, what do you want to do now? Because we found that women got wrapped up in niggling labors and got tired. And then when they went into active labor, they were really tired and more likely to have more interventions. So we made certain that we didn't go into labor tired. And we asked ourselves, what do you want to do now? And how did we know when niggling labor stopped and active labor started? Because active labor, it changes every hour or two. The contractions get more intense, closer together, and longer. And we learned to check ourselves because we were doing the internal work. So we could feel for change inside, and we'd know where we are. We took home birth seriously because we realized throughout time and place, where there was no hospital, there was a chance that the mother of the baby could die. In other words, there were many known and unknown risks. And many women, before pregnancy and in pregnancy, have risks. We also know that few risks become problems. And we know that few problems become tragedies. But we didn't want to have problems and we didn't want to have tragedies. And we didn't want to have to try to get to the hospital very quickly if we felt that there was an emergency. So there wasn't a flying squad like there was in the UK around childbirth that could get there very quickly. So if we transferred to the hospital, we often had to drive ourselves to the hospital. In the United States, we can live many hours from the hospital if we're having a home birth. So we took our skills incredibly seriously, and we paid attention to something around risks and problems and tragedies that we had learned, which was, if the woman feels things are okay, then do trust her. If she's waffling and doesn't know, don't assume. Either way, and if she says, something's not right, trust her and ask her what she wants to do about it. In other words, we paid attention. We had the ability to go to a hospital that traditional women didn't have. And even though people wanted to have natural births, very few of them, with the exception of the deeply religious families, wanted to be able to access medical care if they felt that there was an emergency. Because we hadn't learned the body skills yet in the 1970s, we didn't have them in our head or in our body. But we did learn something about after the birth, because there was beginning to be a discussion about delaying the cutting of the cord, and there began to be a discussion about putting the baby to the breast. Now, what I'm about to say may be very controversial to some of you, but we're going to say it. Because if you're having a home birth, you have to assume there is no hospital, which means you have to do everything you can to prevent anything from becoming a problem that then could become a tragedy. Traditional people know that during labor, a stuck baby is a danger to itself and the mother, because if a baby is stuck and can't be born, it will die, and eventually the mother will die. The other issue in all traditional communities is women bleeding after the birth. They're not as concerned about a big rush of blood, but the slow trickle bleed. But if you have ever been at a birth where there is a big amount of blood that comes out, it can be absolutely terrifying. So you want to try to prevent those things. So what we learned is you don't want to have a stuck baby. And that's where the pink kit or the birthing better body skills really shifted everything that we did around home birth. The result was we got our babies out more easily without as much delay. We were able to prevent those long labors and the potentially stuck baby. Then we were dealing with the potential to bleed, which is infinitely more serious. This is what we learned from our experience at home births using birthing better skills. When the baby is born at a home birth, put it on its stomach. If it's in a puddle of amniotic fluid, put something dry underneath it, and don't touch the mother or the baby until this happens, which can be an extended period of time, which is how do you know the birth is over? And you know the birth is over when a woman can get up, be straight in how she walks, and walk to the toilet and walk back straight. If she is bent over or tired or can't get up, the birth is not over yet. So what we did was to hunker down. The baby was out. It was on its stomach so it could drain the mucus. The mother could touch it if she wanted to. We had warm fluids, at least 4 liters of warm, slightly salty, slightly sweet hydration. And we waited. We didn't touch the cord and we didn't fiddle with the woman until after the placenta came out. That could be in 5 minutes. That could be in 45 minutes. And then we did not do anything, even after the placenta came out, until the woman almost always expresses a desire to get up and go clean up or go to the toilet. And it was seeing how she walked and her behavior that taught us how to safeguard that period after the birth. This is not what's happening at home births. This was not start to happen at hospital births where they would wait for the cord to be a bit limp. They sometimes lay the woman on her back, put the baby to the breast, or the woman sat up, tried to get the baby to feed. And what we saw was women getting disconnected from their body and having many more bleeds because they were not paying attention to that next phase of labor, which was the one that was the most serious and the most dangerous to the mother, which is that period between after the birth and when birth is over. It is over when she can stand up straight, go to the toilet, and come back standing up straight. Anything else it's not over with. And when it's not over with, when a woman is weak, she is more likely to bleed. And so this is a set of skills that we learned. We had no rush. Michel Audin in the early 1980s gave a talk at the first International Home Birth Conference. He stood up there and he said, there is no recorded information that any traditional culture nurses colostrum, and that's true. The idea that you should nurse colostrum was a modern fad. Traditional cultures didn't nurse kids until the milk came in. This is complicated to understand. The reason being, if you put a baby on a dry breast, they suck and suck and suck and suck. And that is more likely to wet the nipple, cause the nipple to crack, develop an infection in the nipple. If the breast is full, there's an abundance of milk, and the baby gulps, 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 only takes about a tablespoon, and they're finished. So in traditional cultures, they all did something for those few days after the birth. They all knew the meconium should get out, so they flushed the baby's system with different things, whether it was giving it to a wet nurse or herbs or other things. They did not nurse until the milk came in. Because if you have a breast infection, you are at risk of getting very, very, very sick, and you don't want to put the baby to the breast. So these are skills that we learned. Many of you might not like these skills, but we did them because it was important to safeguard the third global childbirth goal, which is the recovery of the mother and the baby. And this is why so many cultures secluded the mother and the baby for 40 days or 6 or 7 weeks. What we did was we slowed things down and we watched, and we didn't have very many people who needed to transfer to the hospital. If a woman started to bleed, we gave her from that warm hydration formula 3 times the volume of fluid by mouth that she was bleeding out, because you can become anemic by losing a lot of blood, but you don't want to lose volume and go into shock. So replacing fluid in abundance means that you will have fluid in your cardiovascular system because your body will absorb that fluid, and you may go into the hospital and get tested because you lost a lot of blood and you want to see how anemic you are, but you do not want to go into cardiovascular shock. So these were all skills that we learned, and we abided by them. At some point, we learned external skills like homeopathics and some Chinese herbs. But basically, we paid attention at home births in a different way than we did at a hospital birth, because we didn't want women and babies to transfer to the hospital unless there was really a high medical risk or need, and the family felt that they would be safer in the hospital. We also learned another skill. If we go to the hospital, don't complain. And I'm very serious about this. This is what Birthing Better Families taught me. If you go to the hospital, it's their environment. You went there because you had a concern. Then accept their help. Keep using skills so that you stay grounded for yourself. You can keep using the skills after the birth, but don't bitch. Be grateful. You had that care. Traditional women didn't have that care. So the idea that people became very anti-medical and complained and moaned and groaned, but used medical care, we thought in the early 70s was absolutely outrageous. And it's continued, and it's gotten worse. And that isn't really what should be happening. So our home births, what were they like? A lot of the families, the Birthing Better families who developed the skills, were medically high risk. The ones that were having home births were medically high risk as well. What we learned was that women and men who used skills throughout their home birth and paid attention, slowed things down, waited, were patient, allowed birth to resolve with the birth of the baby, and then allowed post-birth period to take its time to resolve without fiddling with the baby or the mother, making certain that the mother was warm, comfortable, very well hydrated with warm, slightly salty, slightly sweet fluids. And we waited until she knew that she could get up, walk to the toilet, standing upright, and walk back being upright. It's finished. Let's clean up the mess now. And when we did that, we had very, very, very few post-birth problems, although there were some. The most common one was that a piece of the placenta or the membrane didn't come out and a woman had an infection. And the other thing that we did was we did not nurse the baby until the milk came in. If we didn't have any other option, we just took fluid in our mouth and let the baby suck off our lips. We made certain that they didn't look dry, and we would give them fluids that way, sometimes light raspberry leaf tea. But for us as mothers, we made certain we were warm, very well hydrated, ate well, and slowed down and allowed the process of leaving birth behind and the process of becoming a nursing mother ahead of us. Yes, some mothers didn't want to nurse, and that was fine. We didn't care. It's their family. So I hope that some of these skills will help you understand how Birthing Better Families dealt with home births.